On a rainy Tuesday morning in April of 1993, a massive spring flood completely washed away the only wooden bridge leading into the most productive 300 acres of Elias Thorne's farm. When the desperate 68-year-old farmer went to the county office for help, an arrogant young engineer in a crisp white shirt handed him a massive repair bill for $250,000. The engineer laughed in Elias' face and loudly declared that building a safe bridge required complex mathematics and an expensive college degree. But Elias possessed something far more valuable than a piece of paper. He possessed 60 years of raw mechanical experience and absolute stubbornness. He quietly purchased two massive scrapped steel railway cars and built his own crossing. The engineers called it a metal coffin, but 30 years later, heavily loaded 40-ton grain trucks are still rolling safely across Elias Thorne's homemade bridge, completely humiliating every single educated expert who dared to mock him. Let me tell you about the spring of 1993, because you need to understand the sheer panic of that particular planting season to truly appreciate what Elias accomplished. The rain had not stopped falling for 14 straight days. The small creek that quietly separated Elias Thorne's main farmhouse from his massive 300-acre lower field had violently swollen into a raging river of thick brown mud. On the 15th night, a massive uprooted oak tree slammed directly into the wooden support pilings of the old crossing. The ancient bridge splintered like dry matchsticks and washed completely away into the darkness, leaving Elias completely cut off from his most fertile ground right before the critical spring planting season. Without that field, his entire year would be a total financial ruin. Elias did not panic. He drove his rusted pickup truck directly to the county road and bridge department, expecting a simple, practical solution. The county office was warm and clean, completely isolated from the harsh realities of the muddy fields. The chief engineer was a young, ambitious man who wore a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. He had absolutely no calluses on his hands, and he possessed a wall covered in expensive framed university degrees. The young engineer unrolled a massive, complicated blueprint across his mahogany desk and calmly informed Elias that a proper modern bridge would cost exactly $250,000 to construct. Elias stared at the massive number printed on the paper. He calmly stated that $250,000 was more money than his entire farm was worth, and asked if there was a simpler way to cross a 40-foot gap. That is exactly when the young engineer made the biggest mistake of his career. He laughed. It was not a friendly laugh. It was the condescending laugh of an educated man looking completely down on a man wearing muddy boots. The engineer leaned back in his comfortable leather chair and boldly told Elias that bridge building was an exact science reserved exclusively for men with advanced engineering degrees. He claimed that farmers like Elias lacked the advanced mathematics required to understand structural integrity and load-bearing stress. He smugly suggested that Elias should just go to the local bank and sign a massive high-interest loan like everybody else. Elias did not argue, and he did not raise his voice. He simply looked the young, arrogant engineer directly in the eyes, turned his back on the complicated blueprints, and walked completely out of the warm office. He was a completely debt-free man, and he was absolutely not going to surrender his absolute freedom to a local bank just because some college boy told him it was the only way. Let me tell you how a man with absolutely no modern cranes moves a 50-foot steel railway car across a 40-foot deep gorge. He uses the exact same principles of physics that built the ancient world: leverage, absolute patience, and unyielding iron. For the next 2 weeks, Elias and his 3 friends worked from sunrise until the moon came up. They did not use expensive computer software to calculate load distribution. They used thick steel cables, heavy iron pulleys, and 3 old farm tractors working in perfect synchronized harmony. They anchored massive chains to the deep limestone roots of ancient oak trees on the far bank. Using a block and tackle system that multiplied their pulling force, they slowly dragged the massive steel monsters over the edge. Inch by agonizing inch, they slid the first massive steel car across the muddy gap. The heavy cables groaned, and the old tractor engines screamed. But the steel did not slip. Then they did it all over again with the second car. When both massive steel frames finally rested side by side on the solid rock foundation, Elias spent 4 straight days on his hands and knees, welding the 2 structures together. He was 68 years old, breathing thick, welding smoke and burning his calloused hands, but his welds were absolutely flawless. He was fusing solid carbon steel with the desperate focus of a man fighting for his absolute survival. By late September, the bridge was completely finished. It was not painted bright, shiny colors, and it did not have elegant, modern guardrails. It looked exactly like what it was: an indestructible monument to stubbornness and survival. The massive wheat harvest was finally ready to be cut, and Elias was ready to cross. But let me tell you about what happened on the morning of the first harvest, because arrogant men absolutely hate being proven wrong. Just as Elias was firing up his heavy transport truck to make the very first crossing, a shiny black county vehicle sped down the muddy gravel driveway. The young, ambitious engineer stepped out of his clean car, holding a thick legal document. It was a formal condemnation order. The engineer had convinced the local bureaucrats to declare the homemade crossing an illegal hazard. He walked right up to the edge of the creek, his polished shoes getting completely covered in wet mud, and held up the piece of paper like a weapon. He loudly announced to Elias and his friends that crossing the unapproved structure was a direct violation of county law. He smugly warned them that without a proper engineering degree guiding the construction, the homemade welds would instantly shatter under the massive weight of a loaded grain truck. He promised that the heavy steel would fold like cheap paper, sending the driver straight to the bottom of the rocky gorge. He crossed his arms and stood safely back, expecting Elias to surrender to the legal threat. He was desperately waiting for his moment of absolute victory. But Elias did not even look at the piece of paper, and he certainly did not apologize. He simply climbed up into the high cab of his massive transport truck, fully loaded with 40 tons of freshly harvested golden wheat, and looked straight down at the young engineer. The ultimate test of practical physics was about to begin. Let me tell you exactly what happens when 40 tons of rolling weight meets solid carbon steel. Elias Thorne did not argue with the arrogant young engineer, and he certainly did not turn off his ignition. He simply engaged the heavy transmission of his massive transport truck. The enormous diesel engine roared, sending a thick cloud of black exhaust straight up into the crisp autumn air. The engineer stumbled backward, violently dropping his polished briefcase directly into the wet mud. He was desperately waving his legal condemnation order and screaming at the top of his lungs that Elias was committing absolute suicide. But Elias kept his weathered eyes completely focused on the horizon. He released the heavy air brakes, and the massive machine began to slowly roll forward. Now, let me pause right here and ask you to truly picture the sheer terrifying physics of this specific moment. A fully loaded commercial grain truck weighs roughly 80,000 pounds. The young county engineer had spent 4 years at a highly expensive university learning that without deep concrete pilings and complex load distribution matrices, any unsupported span would instantly buckle under that kind of extreme, localized pressure. He stood shivering in the cold mud, holding his breath, fully expecting the massive steel railway cars to violently fold in half and send the stubborn old farmer plunging 40 feet straight down into the rocky, rushing gorge. The massive front tires of the transport truck finally rolled onto the rusted steel deck. The heavy rubber suspension of the truck deeply compressed under the incredible weight, but the homemade bridge did not move. It did not groan, and it did not bend a single microscopic fraction of an inch. The thick carbon steel had been explicitly designed and forged to carry hundreds of tons of heavy locomotive freight across the entire country. It barely even registered the weight of a single loaded grain truck. Elias steadily shifted into second gear and drove his massive harvest straight across the 40-foot gap with the absolute casual confidence of a man driving down a smooth paved highway. When the heavy rear dual tires finally rolled safely off the far side of the steel bridge and onto the solid dirt road, the silence on the muddy riverbank was absolutely deafening. The three older farmers who had helped Elias build the unyielding structure did not cheer, and they did not jump up and down. They simply stood there with quiet, deeply satisfied smiles on their deeply lined faces. The young county engineer looked completely and utterly devastated. His crisp white shirt was terribly stained with wet mud. His incredibly expensive university education and his arrogant authority had just been completely dismantled by a stubborn 68-year-old man with a welding torch and zero debt. The engineer quietly picked up his muddy briefcase, folded his entirely useless piece of paper, and drove his shiny county vehicle back to town without saying another single solitary word. Let me tell you about the undeniable legacy of that specific morning, because the ultimate truth always reveals itself over time. That harvest happened in 1993. The local county eventually built their highly expensive $250,000 modern bridge on a different road entirely. Over the next 3 decades, that modern concrete structure had to be closed and professionally repaired 3 separate times due to severe weather damage and deep structural cracking. But Elias Thorne's homemade scrap metal bridge was never once repaired. It never needed to be. For 30 solid years, heavily loaded commercial grain trucks, heavy diesel tractors, and massive combine harvesters have safely crossed that exact same steel span every single autumn season. It stands today exactly where Elias placed it, an unyielding iron monument, completely humiliating the arrogant experts and proving forever that raw, practical wisdom will always outlast expensive, unproven theory.
Let me ask you something. Why do we so blindly trust men in clean, white shirts with expensive university degrees while completely ignoring the quiet men with thick grease on their hands? It is because we have been conditioned to believe that expensive theory is somehow more valuable than raw, practical experience. The young county engineer understood the complex mathematics of bridge building, but he did not understand the absolute, uncompromising reality of survival. When a farmer like Elias Thorne faces a massive problem, he cannot simply walk away or write a lengthy report about it. He has to physically solve it, or he loses absolutely everything he has ever built. That desperate, unyielding need breeds a kind of mechanical genius that no university on earth can ever successfully teach. Sometimes the absolute most advanced technology in the world is just a stubborn old man, a hot welding torch, and the absolute refusal to surrender. Before we finish, I want to share a small secret. While the stubborn spirit and quiet wisdom of this tale beat loudly in the heart of every rural American town, the specific names and events are a carefully crafted legend. It is a fictional tribute dedicated to the countless debt-free farmers and blue-collar workers who absolutely refuse to surrender their independence to arrogant bureaucrats and educated experts. If you truly believe that raw, practical experience will always defeat arrogant textbook theory, please hit that like button and subscribe to The Farm Legacy. Tell me in the comments right now if you have ever successfully fixed or built something that the so-called experts aggressively told you was completely impossible. Until next time, always remember that true wisdom is measured by what you can actually build, not by the expensive pieces of paper hanging on your wall.